Hello, welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
Merry Christmas, a poor little girl said to the millionaire and handed him a letter that paralyzed the man with fright. The streets of downtown Manhattan sparkled under the glow of Christmas lights, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of roasted chestnuts and pine wreaths. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the heavens, coating the city in a pristine white blanket. It was Christmas Eve and the city pulsed with life, carolers harmonizing on street corners, couples holding hands by store windows showcasing extravagant holiday displays, and last-minute shoppers rushing past with colorful bags. For most, it was a magical evening. For Henry Lancaster, it was just another night. Henry sat in the back seat of his luxury SUV, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through emails on his phone. The warm glow of the screen illuminated his sharp features, salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, a jawline etched from years of ambition, and eyes cold as the icy streets outside. He had built his empire with a singular focus, and emotions like warmth and sentimentality had no place in his life. His driver Carl cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, it looks like traffic's backed up all the way to Fifth Avenue. We might be here a while." Henry didn't even look up. "Then find another way," he said curtly. Carl hesitated. "We're boxed in, sir. The Christmas crowds, you know how it is this time of year." Henry finally glanced out the window, his lips tightening at the sight of a sea of people moving sluggishly through the snowy sidewalks. Vendors called out offers for hot cocoa and candied nuts, and children tugged at their parents' coats, pleading to stop and watch the performers juggling flaming torches and Santa hats. It all grated on Henry's nerves. "Ridiculous," he muttered. With a sharp motion, he opened the car door. "I'll walk. Meet me at the entrance of the Hanover Club in 20 minutes. "Sir, are you sure?" Carl asked, alarmed. "The streets." Henry didn't wait for him to finish. He stepped out onto the icy pavement, pulling his long wool coat tighter against the biting wind. The crowd enveloped him instantly, strangers brushing past, voices blending into an indecipherable hum. He hated this chaos, this mess, but he refused to let it delay him. The charity gala at the Hanover Club was critical to his image, even if he personally found the idea of Christmas charity as useful as coal in a furnace. As Henry strode through the crowd, someone caught his eye. She stood near the corner of 47th Street, a tiny figure barely noticeable amidst the throngs of bustling bodies. The girl couldn't have been more than 9 years old, her small frame wrapped in a too-thin coat that hung awkwardly on her shoulders. A knitted hat drooped over her curls, and her boots, if they could even be called that, had holes so large that her socks peeked through. She was clutching a piece of paper, her gloveless hands red from the cold. Henry stopped, frowning. He wasn't sure why he paused. Perhaps it was the way she seemed out of place, like a fragile ornament left forgotten in the snow. Her gaze swept the crowd with a peculiar intensity, and when her eyes locked with his, she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that felt startling in its simplicity. The girl stepped forward, her movements tentative but determined. "Hello, mister," she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the cacophony of the street. She held out the piece of paper toward him. "This is for you." Henry blinked, caught off guard. "For me?" he asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. The girl nodded, her dark eyes unwavering. "Please. It's important." Henry glanced around, half expecting to see a camera crew hidden nearby, waiting to capture him in some embarrassing stunt. But there was nothing, only the girl, standing there with the letter in her trembling hands. With a sigh of impatience, he took the paper from her. It was folded neatly, the edges slightly worn. "What is this?" "A school project," he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. "Just read it," she said simply. Henry unfolded the paper, the faint scent of cinnamon wafting from it, as if it had been stored near Christmas spices. His eyes scanned the words, and in an instant, the bustling world around him seemed to fade into silence. Henry's chest tightened. His grip on the paper grew firmer as he continued reading. The words on the page were not random. They were deliberate, precise, and disturbingly personal. They spoke of a moment he had long buried, a decision made in the shadows of his youth, one that had secured his fortune at the cost of someone else's ruin. The letter detailed things no one else could possibly know, dredging up memories he had worked tirelessly to forget. He stared at the girl, his heart pounding. "Who wrote this?" he demanded, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. The girl tilted her head slightly, as if considering her answer. "It doesn't matter," she said after a pause. "What matters is that you read it." Her calmness only infuriated him further. "Listen, kid, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but—" "You'll understand," she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "When you follow the address." Henry froze. At the bottom of the letter, scrawled in a neat but childlike hand, was an address. It wasn't a part of the city he frequented, far from it, in fact. Before he could press her further, the girl turned on her heel and darted into the crowd. "Wait!" Henry called, his voice cutting through the cold air. But she was gone, her small figure swallowed by the river of holiday shoppers. For a moment, Henry stood rooted in place, his breath fogging the air as his mind raced. He reread the letter, his pulse hammering in his ears. How could she know these things? The details in the letter were too precise to be coincidence. "Sir?" Henry turned to see Carl standing nearby, his face lined with worry. "I came to find you when you didn't return," the driver explained. "Is everything all right?" Henry hesitated, then folded the letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. "Everything's fine," he said curtly. "Let's go." Carl didn't press the matter, falling into step behind him as they navigated back toward the car. But as Henry slid into the leather seat, he couldn't shake the lingering unease. The lights of the city blurred past the window, their cheerful glow feeling almost mocking. For the first time in years, Henry Lancaster felt something unfamiliar: doubt. Doubt in the life he had built, doubt in the choices he had made. And for the first time, he wondered if the ghosts of his past might finally be catching up to him. The city sparkled with a festive glow, but Henry Lancaster felt none of its warmth. He sat alone in the dim light of his penthouse, a glass of bourbon untouched on the marble table before him. The letter the girl had given him lay unfolded in his hand, its words burning into his mind like the embers of a fire he thought he had long extinguished. "Do you believe in miracles, Mr. Lancaster? Because this Christmas you might need one. What you did all those years ago, it wasn't forgotten. It's time to make things right. Time is running out. If you want to understand, come to 115 Sparrow Lane by midnight." Sparrow Lane. The name conjured a faint, unwelcome flicker of recognition. He hadn't been there in decades, not since. Henry shook his head, refusing to let his mind travel too far into the past. The memories were dangerous, an untamed beast he had spent years locking away. "Who could have written this?" he muttered under his breath, his voice echoing in the vast stillness of the penthouse. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the twinkling city skyline. Whoever had sent that letter not only knew his name but also his darkest secret. A secret he had buried so deeply he thought it had been forgotten. But it hadn't. Years ago, Henry had been a man of ambition but not yet of fortune. Fresh out of business school, he had partnered with his closest friend, Thomas Grayson, a man brimming with ideas but naive when it came to the cutthroat nature of business. Together, they had founded a small tech company, pouring every ounce of their energy and savings into making it a success. It wasn't long before Henry saw an opportunity, a chance to leapfrog over the competition and secure a deal that would catapult their company into the stratosphere. But there was a catch: it required capital they didn't have, and it meant cutting Thomas out of the deal. Henry remembered the choice he had made. The forged signature. The abrupt, cold betrayal. Thomas had been left with nothing but a mountain of debt, and the last Henry had heard, his old friend had moved to a small, rundown house on the outskirts of town, Sparrow Lane. It had been a necessary evil, Henry had always told himself. A stepping stone. Without that deal, he wouldn't be the man he was today, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, living in a penthouse with more rooms than he could count. But tonight, the letter had cracked that veneer of justification wide open. Henry's eyes flicked to the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. 11:05 p.m. He drummed his fingers on the table. Part of him wanted to ignore the letter altogether. It could be a hoax, some scam artist fishing for money. But there was something about the girl, the calm certainty in her voice, the way she had disappeared into the crowd, that left him unsettled. Against his better judgment, Henry stood and grabbed his coat. He slipped the letter into his pocket, poured the bourbon down the sink, and headed to the private elevator that led to the building's underground garage. The streets of the city were quieter now. Most of the Christmas Eve revelers had retreated to their homes, their laughter and warmth contained behind glowing windows. Henry drove himself, the purr of the luxury car's engine a soft hum against the backdrop of falling snow. The further he got from the heart of the city, the darker and more desolate the streets became. By the time he turned onto Sparrow Lane, the lavish townhouses and upscale shops were distant memories. Here, the streetlights were dim, and the houses, most of them small and weather-beaten, stood like forgotten soldiers in the snow. He parked in front of 115 Sparrow Lane, his headlights casting a pale glow on the small, sagging house. Its paint was peeling, the windows dark. There was no Christmas wreath on the door, no cheerful decorations. Just a solitary light shining faintly from the porch, like a ghostly beacon. Henry hesitated. A part of him wanted to drive away, to leave this place and never look back. But the letter's words haunted him, it's time to make things right. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car. The snow crunched beneath his feet as he approached the house. He knocked on the door, his hand trembling slightly, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with tired eyes and a shawl draped over her shoulders. She squinted at him, her expression cautious. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice hoarse but kind. Henry faltered. He wasn't sure how to explain himself. "I received a letter. A little girl gave it to me. She said I needed to come here." The woman's face softened, though her eyes held a glimmer of sadness. "You're here because of Lila," she said quietly. Henry frowned. "Lila? The girl? Who is she?" The woman stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The house was cold, the furniture sparse but neat. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments faded and mismatched. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single photo in a cracked frame. Henry recognized the face immediately. It was Thomas. "That's him, isn't it?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded. "Thomas was my son." Her gaze pierced him, and for a moment, Henry felt as though she could see straight through him. "You knew him?" Yes. We were business partners a long time ago." The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she motioned for him to sit at the small dining table, where a faded tablecloth and two mismatched chairs waited. Henry lowered himself into one of the chairs, his mind racing. "I don't understand," he said. "Who sent the letter? And the girl, Lila, where is she?" "She's upstairs," the woman said. "Sleeping. It's been a long day for her." Henry's confusion deepened. "Then you sent the letter?" The woman shook her head. "No, Mr. Lancaster. That letter was Lila's idea. She insisted." Her expression softened as she added, "She wanted you to come." "Why?" Henry demanded. "What does she know about me? About Thomas?" The woman sighed, her eyes filling with a deep sadness. "Because you're the reason we ended up here," she said simply. "And because she believes that people can change." Her words struck Henry like a blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. "She doesn't know everything," the woman continued. "Only that you were important to her grandfather. That something went wrong between you two. But she wanted to give you a chance to make amends." Henry's throat tightened. "I don't." "She sees the good in people," the woman interrupted gently. "Even when the rest of us can't." Henry sat in stunned silence, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. The room seemed to close in, the walls heavy with the memories he had tried so hard to escape. "Thomas," he said finally. "What happened to him?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "He died 2 years ago," she said. "Cancer. He worked himself to the bone trying to give us a better life, but he never could recover from what happened. He forgave you, you know. In the end, he said he hoped you found peace." Her words were a dagger to Henry's chest. The man he had betrayed, ruined, had forgiven him. But could he forgive himself? The house was silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath Henry's polished shoes. He sat at the worn dining table, his eyes locked on the photo of Thomas Grayson perched above the fireplace. The image of his former friend stared back at him, a younger man, smiling, carefree, his arms slung around a laughing little boy. Henry's chest tightened. "Lila's his granddaughter?" he asked, breaking the quiet. The elderly woman nodded, her hands resting on the edge of the table. "She is. Her mother, my daughter Alice, passed away when Lila was just a baby." Thomas raised her until her voice trailed off and she shook her head. "Well, until it was just me." Henry leaned back in his chair, the letter burning a hole in his pocket. "You said Lila wrote the letter. Why? What does she want from me?" The woman, Mrs. Grayson, folded her hands, her gaze distant. "Lila doesn't want anything from you, Mr. Lancaster. She doesn't know about your past with her grandfather, not the details anyway. But she's always had this belief that even the worst mistakes can be forgiven, and the people who make them can be saved." "Saved," Henry repeated bitterly, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "You think I need saving?" Mrs. Grayson studied him, her tired eyes softening. "I think you wouldn't have come here if you didn't already know the answer to that." Before Henry could respond, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. His eyes flicked to the staircase at the far end of the room, where a small figure began descending. Lila appeared, her tiny frame swaddled in a thick blanket that dragged behind her like a cape. Her hair was wild from sleep, her cheeks flushed, but her dark eyes gleamed with the same unshakable determination he'd seen earlier that night. She stopped halfway down the stairs, clutching the banister, and looked directly at Henry. "You came," she said, her voice soft but sure. Henry straightened in his chair, unsure how to respond. Yes," he said finally. "I came." Lila nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. She descended the rest of the stairs, her blanket trailing behind her like the train of a royal robe, and approached the table. "Are you going to make it right?" she asked, standing beside her grandmother. Henry stiffened. "Make what right?" "You hurt him," Lila said simply. "Grandpa. A long time ago." Mrs. Grayson tensed. "Lila," she began, but the girl shook her head. "It's okay, Grandma," she said, her voice calm. She turned back to Henry. "I heard Grandpa talk about you before he died. He said you used to be his best friend. He said you were really smart and funny. But he was sad too. Sad because you did something bad and never said you were sorry." Henry's heart pounded. He glanced at Mrs. Grayson, but she only watched him silently, her face unreadable. Henry faltered, the words catching in his throat. The room seemed unbearably small, the air heavy with expectation. "I don't know if I can make it right," he said finally, his voice low. "Some things can't be fixed." "Grandpa said they could," Lila said matter-of-factly. "He said you just have to try." Henry looked at her, stunned. She said it so simply, as if redemption were as easy as tying a shoe. But the weight of his betrayal was crushing. How could a few words, or even 1,000, ever repair what he had done? Mrs. Grayson cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Thomas never hated you, Henry," she said, her voice soft. "He was angry for a long time, yes. Hurt. But in the end he let it go. Not for your sake, for his. He didn't want to leave this world carrying bitterness." Henry felt his throat tighten. The image of Thomas, sick and dying, forgiving him from afar, it was unbearable. He had spent decades justifying his actions as the cost of success, telling himself that Thomas had simply been weak, too soft for the brutal world of business. But now, sitting in this cold little house, staring into the eyes of the man's granddaughter, his excuses felt hollow. Why did he stay here? Henry asked suddenly, gesturing to the house. He could have moved on. He was talented, capable, he could have started over somewhere else. Mrs. Grayson shook her head. Starting over isn't as easy as it sounds, Mr. Lancaster. After what happened, he lost everything. His reputation, his savings. He was blacklisted from the industry, couldn't get work anywhere in the city. This house was all we had left. Her words were a blade, cutting through the layers of denial Henry had wrapped around himself. And he stayed because of Lila, she added, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. She gave him a reason to keep going. She gave him hope. Henry sat in silence, his thoughts a storm of guilt and uncertainty. He had come here seeking answers, but now that he had them, they felt like a burden too heavy to carry. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low. Mrs. Grayson tilted her head, surprised. "Want from you? We don't want anything." Henry frowned. "Then why send the letter? Why bring me here?" "It wasn't about what we wanted," Mrs. Grayson said. "It was about what you needed." Lila stepped closer, her dark eyes searching his. "You need to fix it," she said softly. "For Grandpa. And for you." Henry looked at her, his chest tightening. "How?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know," Lila admitted. "But you're smart. You'll figure it out." Her words, spoken with such innocent faith, hit him harder than any accusation. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, the sound echoing through the small room. Henry stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I thank you," he said awkwardly, looking at Mrs. Grayson. "For letting me in. For everything." She nodded, her expression kind but wary. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Lancaster." Henry turned to Lila, who watched him with an intensity that seemed far beyond her years. "Good night, Lila," he said. "Good night," she replied. "And Merry Christmas?" Henry paused, the words catching him off guard. He hadn't wished anyone a Merry Christmas in years, but something about the way she said it made him feel lighter. As he stepped out into the cold, snowy night, the weight of the past still clung to him, but so did something else, the faint glimmer of possibility. Henry Lancaster drove back into the heart of the city, but the dazzling holiday lights seemed dimmer now, their cheer mocking the storm brewing inside him. The streets were quieter, the festive rush giving way to the stillness of early Christmas morning. Snow continued to fall, settling on rooftops and sidewalks, turning Manhattan into a scene out of a holiday postcard. Yet, for the first time in decades, Henry felt utterly lost. The words of Lila and her grandmother echoed in his mind. "You need to fix it. For Grandpa. And for you." By the time he reached his penthouse, the clock was ticking toward 2 a.m. Henry poured himself another glass of bourbon but didn't drink it. Instead, he sat by the window overlooking Central Park, the folded letter still in his pocket. Memories began to claw their way to the surface, Thomas's voice, his laughter, the way they'd stayed up late in their small, shared office years ago, dreaming of success. Thomas had been the dreamer, always optimistic, always believing that the world was good. Henry, on the other hand, had been pragmatic, ruthless even. When the opportunity arose to sell their company to a major investor, it should have been a victory for both of them. But Henry had seen the writing on the wall, the investor wanted control, and there wasn't room for two decision-makers. All it took was one forged signature, one legal maneuver to cut Thomas out of the deal entirely. Henry had told himself it was just business. Nothing personal. But now, staring at the snow swirling outside, he knew better. It had been personal. It had been a betrayal. The memories tightened their grip, pulling him into the past. He could see Thomas's face the last time they'd spoken, a mixture of shock, hurt, and anger. "You've destroyed me," Thomas had said, his voice cracking. "I thought we were brothers." Henry had said nothing. What was there to say? A knock at the door pulled Henry from his thoughts. He frowned. Who would come here at this hour? Rising from his chair, he crossed the room and opened the door to find his driver, Carl, standing there with an envelope in his hand. "Sir," Carl said hesitantly, holding out the envelope. "This was left on the car while I was waiting. It's addressed to you." Henry took the envelope, his pulse quickening. It was small, the handwriting on the front neat and deliberate, "To Mr. Lancaster." Carl gave a polite nod and turned to leave. Henry shut the door, his hands trembling slightly as he tore open the envelope. Inside was another note written on plain white paper. You can't change the past, but you can change what happens next. Start with Sparrow Lane. You know what to do. Henry stared at the note, his mind racing. The message was simple, but it stirred something deep inside him. He had built an empire on ruthless decisions, on putting his own success above everything and everyone. But for the first time, he wondered if it was possible to undo some of the damage. Start with Sparrow Lane, the note had said. He thought of Lila, her unwavering belief that he could fix it. Could she be right? By dawn, Henry had made his decision. He hadn't slept, but there was a new clarity in his mind. He retrieved his laptop from his desk and began working, the pale morning light creeping into the room as his plan unfolded. Step 1: The house. The first thing he did was contact a real estate agent he knew, waking her with a call before sunrise. I need the deed for 115 Sparrow Lane, Henry said, his tone brooking no argument. Mr. Lancaster, it's Christmas morning, the agent groaned. And I'll pay double for the inconvenience, Henry replied briskly. Within an hour, the paperwork was in motion. By the end of the week, the house wouldn't just belong to Mrs. Grayson, it would be renovated and fully paid off. Step 2: The neighborhood. Henry turned his focus to the broader picture. Sparrow Lane wasn't just one house, it was a struggling community filled with families barely scraping by. He reached out to one of his charitable foundations, instructing them to create a new initiative for the neighborhood: scholarships for local children, job training programs for adults, and grants for small businesses. We'll call it the Thomas Grayson Initiative, he told his assistant. Grayson? She repeated, surprised. Yes, Henry said firmly. Make sure his name is on everything. Finally, Henry turned his attention to Lila. He didn't know what dreams she might have, but he was determined to give her every opportunity. He called the headmistress of one of the most prestigious private schools in the state, securing a full scholarship for Lila. This isn't just a donation, Henry insisted. It's an investment. Make sure she gets everything she needs to succeed. By the time Henry finished, the sun was high in the sky. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted but lighter than he'd felt in years. He picked up his phone and dialed Mrs. Grayson's number, the slip of paper with her contact details still on his desk from the night before. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice cautious. Hello. It's Henry Lancaster, he said. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her tone was measured. What do you need, Mr. Lancaster? I just wanted to say thank you, Henry said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. For letting me in last night. For letting me see what I needed to see. Mrs. Grayson said nothing, but Henry thought he could hear a soft intake of breath on the other end. I know I can't undo what I did to Thomas, he continued. But I'd like to try to help now. For you. For Lila. For your family. Mrs. Grayson's voice, when it came, was quiet but resolute. We don't need your money, Mr. Lancaster. I'm not just offering money, Henry said. I'm offering a chance to rebuild. I'll make sure the house is repaired and secure. I'll make sure Lila gets the education she deserves. And I'll make sure your neighborhood gets the support it needs. Another pause. When Mrs. Grayson spoke again, her voice was softer. You can't buy forgiveness, Mr. Lancaster. I'm not trying to buy anything, Henry said. I'm trying to honor Thomas. To do something good in his name. By the time Henry hung up, the weight on his chest had begun to lift. He stepped onto the balcony, the cold air biting at his skin, and looked out over the city. It wasn't enough, not yet. There was still so much to do, so much he needed to atone for. But for the first time in years, Henry felt something new stirring inside him, hope. As the bells of a nearby church rang out across the city, Henry closed his eyes. Merry Christmas, Thomas, he whispered. Henry Lancaster had never spent a Christmas morning like this. In years past, the day had been little more than a formality, a lavish but impersonal brunch with business acquaintances, polite toasts to a holiday he didn't care for, and a return to his routine by the afternoon. But this year, there was no glittering gathering, no grandiose celebration. Instead, Henry found himself driving back to Sparrow Lane, a neighborhood still cloaked in snow and silence as the morning sun reflected off icy rooftops. In the passenger seat was a thick envelope, its contents carefully prepared throughout the night. Property deeds, scholarship paperwork, and plans for a neighborhood revitalization initiative were all meticulously organized. Yet, despite the hours of planning and the sheer magnitude of what he had set in motion, Henry felt restless. Would it be enough? Could it ever be enough? When Henry knocked on the door of 115 Sparrow Lane, it was Lila who answered. Her dark eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "You came back," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the guarded tone of someone who wasn't yet sure what to believe. Henry crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "I did. Is your grandmother home?" Lila nodded slowly, then called over her shoulder, "Grandma, he's here again." Mrs. Grayson appeared moments later, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Her expression was unreadable as she took in the sight of Henry on her doorstep, holding the envelope like an olive branch. "Good morning, Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice steady but cool. "Good morning," Henry replied. He hesitated, then offered her the envelope. "I wanted to show you something. I've been working on it since last night." Mrs. Grayson glanced at Lila, who stood silently at her side, before stepping aside to let him in. The house was just as cold and unadorned as it had been the night before, but Henry noticed a small plate of cookies on the table, likely set out in a modest nod to the holiday. They sat at the table, the envelope between them. Mrs. Grayson opened it carefully, pulling out each document and scanning it in silence. Henry watched her closely, trying to read her expression, but her face remained impassive. "What's all this?" she asked, finally setting the papers down. "It's a start," Henry said. "The house will be yours outright, no mortgage, no payments. I'll cover the renovations myself, and you'll have the deed by the end of the week." Mrs. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not all," Henry continued. "I've also arranged a full scholarship for Lila. She'll get the best education possible, with tutoring, supplies, everything she needs. And the Thomas Grayson initiative," he hesitated, suddenly unsure of how his words would land. "It's a new foundation I've set up. It'll fund job training, grants for small businesses, and scholarships for families in this neighborhood. All in Thomas's name." Mrs. Grayson stared at him for a long moment. Then she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You've done all this in one night," she said quietly. "Yes. And you think it'll fix things?" Henry's throat tightened. "I don't know if anything can fix what I've done. But I had to do something." Lila, who had been sitting silently beside her grandmother, finally spoke. "Grandpa used to say you were smart," she said, her small voice breaking the tension in the room. "But he also said you were lonely. Are you lonely, Mr. Lancaster?" Henry blinked, caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come immediately. Was he lonely? He had never thought about it in those terms. His days were filled with meetings, his nights with carefully curated events. But the silence that greeted him in his penthouse each evening had grown heavier over the years, hadn't it? "I think I am," he admitted finally, his voice softer than he intended. Lila tilted her head. "Then maybe you need a Christmas present too." "Lila," Mrs. Grayson began, her tone firm. But Lila ignored her, hopping down from her chair and disappearing into the other room. She returned moments later with a small, hand-wrapped package, the paper slightly wrinkled and the bow uneven. She handed it to Henry with a shy smile. "Merry Christmas," she said. Henry stared at the package, his throat tightening again. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small, handmade ornament, a wooden star painted gold, with the name Thomas written in delicate black letters across the center. "It was Grandpa's favorite," Lila explained. "We made it together when I was little." Henry ran his fingers over the rough edges of the star, his chest heavy. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. The weight of the room shifted, a fragile silence settling over them. Mrs. Grayson sighed, breaking it. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice softer now, "I don't know if I can forgive you. What you did to Thomas, it broke him. It broke our family. But Lila believes in second chances. And for her sake, I'm willing to see where this goes." Henry nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's all I can ask. But don't think money is enough," she added sharply. "This isn't about charity. It's about doing the right thing. About showing up. Not just today, but every day after." "I understand," Henry said. For the first time, Mrs. Grayson gave him a small nod of approval. Good. Then let's start there. The morning unfolded quietly but warmly. Henry stayed longer than he had planned, helping Mrs. Grayson with small household tasks while Lila showed him her collection of old books and drawings. By noon, the three of them sat down for a modest Christmas meal: ham, mashed potatoes, and green beans, shared over laughter and tentative stories about Thomas. For the first time in years, Henry felt something shift inside him. It wasn't absolution, but it was something close to peace. As Henry prepared to leave that afternoon, Lila ran to him, her arms outstretched. For a moment, he froze. He wasn't used to this kind of affection. But then he crouched down, allowing her to hug him tightly. "Don't forget to come back," she whispered. "I won't," he promised. As he drove away from Sparrow Lane, the wooden star resting on the passenger seat beside him, Henry felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He had started this journey thinking it was about fixing the past, but now he realized it was about building something new. 1 year later, Christmas Eve had arrived again. The snow fell gently on Sparrow Lane, now almost unrecognizable from the bleak and desolate neighborhood it had been. Vibrant holiday lights adorned every house, wreaths hung on freshly painted doors, and the sound of children laughing and carolers singing filled the air. At 115 Sparrow Lane, a warm glow emanated from every window. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and freshly baked cookies wafted through the air. The once dilapidated house had been completely transformed: new walls, a sturdy roof, and even a glowing fireplace that crackled cheerfully in the corner of the living room. On the mantel above it sat a small golden star, the word Thomas etched delicately across its surface. Henry Lancaster stood near the tree, admiring its beauty. He felt like an outsider, still unsure if he truly belonged in this scene of warmth and family, but he stayed nonetheless. Lila ran past him, holding a tray of cookies, her laughter infectious as she dodged the hands of 2 neighborhood boys who were chasing her. "Careful, Lila." Mrs. Grayson called from the kitchen, though there was a smile in her voice. She entered the room moments later, drying her hands on a towel. She stopped when she saw Henry standing by the tree, a faraway look in his eyes. "Are you all right, Mr. Lancaster?" she asked. Henry turned, startled. Even after all these months of coming back to Sparrow Lane every week, she still called him Mr. Lancaster, and he still didn't know if it was out of respect or residual wariness. "I'm fine," he said. Then, after a pause, "I was just thinking about him." Mrs. Grayson's expression softened. She followed his gaze to the golden star. "You've done a lot this past year, Henry," she said. It was one of the first times she'd used his first name. Thomas would have been proud. Henry's throat tightened. "I hope so." The past year had been a whirlwind of change, not just for Sparrow Lane, but for Henry himself. The Thomas Grayson initiative had launched with a bang, bringing jobs, funding, and hope to the neighborhood. The Foundation's programs had already helped dozens of families, providing everything from small business grants to scholarships for children like Lila. But it wasn't just the initiative that had changed things. Henry had changed. He no longer hid in the shadows of his penthouse, avoiding the world. He had made Sparrow Lane a regular part of his life, helping with the repairs, attending community meetings, and getting to know the people who lived there. He had even hosted a summer block party, awkwardly manning the grill as kids ran around spraying each other with water balloons. And then there was Lila. If anyone had been the light guiding him through this journey, it was her. Her unwavering belief in him, her conviction that people could change, had become a beacon of hope he hadn't realized he needed. She had taken to calling him Uncle Henry, a title that felt foreign at first but now filled him with a strange, unfamiliar warmth every time she said it. As the night wore on, the living room grew crowded with guests. Families from the neighborhood had come by to celebrate, sharing food, stories, and laughter. Henry found himself seated at the dining table, watching the scene unfold around him. Lila climbed onto a chair, clinking a spoon against a glass to get everyone's attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning to her. "Okay, everyone," she said, her voice full of excitement. "It's time to do something special." The crowd murmured in curiosity. Lila beamed and held up a small piece of paper. "Last year, on Christmas Eve, I gave Uncle Henry a letter," she said. "And it changed everything?" Henry froze, his heart pounding. Now, I think we should all write letters, Lila continued. Letters to someone we love, someone we miss, or someone we need to forgive. Christmas is the perfect time to tell people how we feel, right? The room erupted in applause, and soon enough, everyone was bustling to find pens and paper. Lila hopped down from her chair and approached Henry with a grin. Here, she said, handing him a piece of paper and a pen. Henry looked at her, then down at the blank page. Who should I write to? He asked. Lila tilted her head thoughtfully. Whoever's in your heart. Henry nodded slowly. He sat at the table, staring at the paper for a long moment before finally putting pen to it. Dear Thomas, it's been a year since I found my way back to Sparrow Lane, and not a day goes by that I don't think about you. I've spent decades running from the memory of what I did to you, justifying it as ambition, telling myself it was the cost of success. But I know now that it wasn't worth it, not the money, not the power, not the empire I built on the foundation of your trust. I can never undo the harm I caused you. But I can honor you by being better. By helping the people you loved. By making sure that Lila and your family have the life they deserve. I'll never stop trying to make things right. And wherever you are, I hope you've found peace. Merry Christmas, Thomas. Henry folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, Mrs. Grayson approached him. You look lighter, she said, her tone teasing. Henry smiled faintly. I think I am. Lila ran over, grabbing his hand. Come outside, Uncle Henry, she said, tugging him toward the door. The three of them stepped onto the porch, the crisp night air biting at their cheeks. The neighborhood was silent now, the snow glittering under the soft glow of the streetlights. Look, Lila whispered, pointing to the sky. Henry followed her gaze. Above them, a single, bright star shone more brilliantly than the others, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Lila leaned against him, her small hand still clutching his. It's Grandpa, she said softly. He's watching us. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't believe in miracles, not really. But in that moment, standing on the porch of 115 Sparrow Lane, surrounded by the people he had hurt and now sought to protect, he thought that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't as impossible as he'd once believed. Merry Christmas, Lila, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Merry Christmas, Uncle Henry, she replied. As the night wore on and Henry prepared to leave, he turned to Mrs. Grayson one last time. Thank you, he said simply. She smiled faintly. You're not done yet, Henry. Christmas isn't the end. It's the beginning. Henry nodded. She was right. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey of redemption, forgiveness, and the true meaning of Christmas. We hope Henry's story inspired you to believe in second chances and the power of kindness. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and stir the soul. Your support helps us continue creating content that spreads hope and joy. From all of us here, Merry Christmas, and may your season be filled with love, laughter, and miracles.